Hello, folks. Real pleasure to have Bret Greenstein from Cognizant, who heads their data and AI practice. He's going to present, I love the title, Modern Decisioning. We came out of 2020 with a whole bunch of new data streams. I wrote a note about 12 different streams, everything from the John Hopkins COVID data to obviously during the election, the polling data, census data, new sports data with shortened seasons and so on. And yet it seemed like we didn't use much of it. So Bret, thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Vinnie. So I lead AI and data for Cognizant. I get to work with companies across every industry and all around the world who are actively transforming the way they make decisions, from modernizing data to the application of advanced analytics and AI. And I spent my whole career working in fields around data, knowledge management, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. I was a CIO for a company based in Asia. So it has been a phenomenal journey for me, and I'm excited to be able to share some of these thoughts around how decisioning is being done now and how the application of AI is really changing business. I'm really struck by the principle that somehow, up until now, we were able to make decisions sometimes in handwritten ledgers. I grabbed this image because it reminded me of my grandfather's factory, and he had giant books of numbers and big calculators you would crank with a hand, and he somehow ran a business that way. And yet it's not that different than the spreadsheets most people use to make decisions today, and it's crude. Human beings make judgments based on just a couple of factors, the data that they saw that day, gut feel, all kinds of really, really bad methods. But they're decent decisions that are perfectly fine when there's not a lot of change. But we're not in a world without a lot of change. We're in a world of pandemics and global warming and all kinds of change all around us that affects our businesses. We all wish that we were looking at the world through the lens of these beautiful dashboards and command centers. And when something happened anywhere in our business, we would instantly know, or even better, know ahead of time that something happened. But the reality is not this. The reality is we're all waiting for someone to email us bad news. We wake up in the morning to see what's happening. Most of us look at reports. I talk to companies all around the world. We're buried under thousands of reports they have to maintain, everyone wanting reports. But reports are backwards looking. They're history. And they don't tell you what you need to know, which is what's going to happen. And they certainly don't tell you what's most important, which is why. So recently I've been working with companies, especially during the pandemic, who are recognizing huge shifts in revenue. Several consumer-facing companies, a soft drink company and convenience store companies, who suddenly realized that human behavior changed during the pandemic. They had no idea why. Were people not buying this and started buying that? Why was revenue per truck dropping off as they were delivering products across the country? And it turns out the reasons why are often due to data you don't control. And also, most people are not very good at looking at what we call causality, which is understanding true root cause. So causality is all about knowing which data at any given moment has the most effect on your business. And it turns out that in the past, those retail companies could look at seasonality and location and weather and generally have a pretty good sense of what they're going to need to have stocked in the stores and how much of it would sell. But now, during things like pandemics, you've got to deal with huge uncertainty in lockdowns and policies and numbers of cases. We built a massive database using the data that you referred to earlier, Johns Hopkins and Oxford data, to look at the local variations on policies across the world and by state. So you could see when lockdowns were occurring and what effect it might have. That external data has a huge effect on the why things are occurring. I think what most companies began to realize this past year is that external data is a huge factor in what's occurring and what they need to do. Now, the other thing that people don't understand is which data matters. I love this graphic, this idea of a needle and a needle stack. When we think about the data that pervades our business, most of us are buried under the data of our enterprise. That's the data in our ERP systems and our CRM systems and HR systems and manufacturing floor systems. That represents what we control and the data that represents what we do. But the data that matters is often far outside of where we are. So sometimes the data that's going to drive what happens in your business is something you can't see. Most recently in Texas, look at the influence and change that weather had, and the strange energy bills that people got suddenly spiking have no explanation, for the average user, because the data that matters that would predict that energy bill was not something visible to the people who are managing their energy costs. The other thing that occurred, and I thought this was really interesting, was the impact of social media and human behavior on buying patterns, especially during the pandemic. At some point early in the pandemic, the world ran out of toilet paper, and there's no explanation for it. There's nothing changed in our lives that required us to have more toilet paper, except human behavior began a hoarding methodology or mindset that caused people to grab toilet paper. Now, that was unpredictable, but shortly after, there were shortages in other products, and they were quite variable. Large retailers were telling us consistently that in some regions, some things ran out more than others. One of the things that surprised a lot of people was the shortage of flour for baking, and that occurred sometime in the summertime. It made no sense to most of the retailers, and it also was geographic. It didn't happen everywhere. Well, it turns out that people on social media were talking about making sourdough bread and other home comfort foods because they couldn't go to restaurants and stores and buy fresh things. So they were talking about it for a month and a half before the flour shortage. How many retailers and suppliers and manufacturers were really looking at social media to see the trends that were spiking and to notice that these things matter? Now, we see spiky behavior every day. We're seeing it now with people shorting stocks. We see CEOs tweeting about things that drive, dynamics across the industry. Social media tells us a lot, and all the unstructured data around that as well tells us about what people are thinking and feeling and their sentiment, which then leads to decisions which drive not just what happens in retail, but all the way back through the supply chain. Recently, also, supply chains have been disrupted in automotive. This occurred for reasons that are actually very predictable if you think about it. There were chip shortages and chip supply chains and all kinds of policies that influenced the flow of electronics from China to the US during the pandemic. There was also obviously a difficulty in transport during the time. And all of a sudden, you've got plants in Michigan needing to shut down, and just this week, other plants in California shutting down because of supply issues. There are leading indicators outside of your enterprise that you have to watch. And that's really the point. Now, what everyone really needs is to know what's going to happen next. Now, predictive models are not new, but most of the predictive models that I've observed in the industry are people drawing a straight line through past data to try to extrapolate future conditions, future data. And they're almost always wrong, but they're even more wrong when times of change are occurring, as we're going through right now. So I worked with a soft drink company who had predictive models, and they thought they had a pretty good sense of supply and demand until the summertime of last year, and all of that went crazy. Now, what was good for them is they had already built a foundation of data. So if you've taken the data from your silos and the legacy systems and local warehouses and wherever the data sits, and made it much more of a fabric and foundation of your enterprise, then the ability to build predictive models is better. If you've also embraced that third-party data, it's even better still. But what we learned in that work was that we could very rapidly build multiple machine learning predictive models. It cost us almost nothing to do this. And what it did, it gave 82% higher predictability in the supply chain from the historic models that had been used by the company before. Huge difference. Now, they couldn't have done it if they hadn't already done some work to prepare their data. That's a lesson for all of us. We need to prepare for change tomorrow by getting our data in order now, knowing which data matters, and then beginning to leverage new techniques like machine learning to build truly predictive models. The other thing we learned is that any predictive model is fragile. It's only true while the conditions exist when you trained it. So for that company, we actually created multiple models under different conditions, and then we created a front end that helped pick which model might be most accurate. We also even added another system outside of the models that measured, called a sensitivity analysis to understand confidence levels of the predictions. Now, it sounds complicated. There are actually a lot of tools and methods to do this. It was very doable. But more importantly, our client knew which model to pick, what the likely outcome was going to be. And then from that, they were able to save an enormous amount of money by making their supply chain more efficient because they could predict demand much better. I think for all of us who do any role where you make decisions, When you ask your team what's going on and they tell you revenue is down or morale is down, that's just what happened. If you ask them why, there's a popular method of operations where you just keep asking why, the 5 whys, until someone finally gets you to the root cause. But that still requires human beings, and it's still slow. What should happen is your system should tell you what happened, flag it. They should know why it happened using causality analysis. And they should also come in and say, you know what, next week, if things don't change, this is what we think will happen. So not only is revenue down today, it's down because buyers in whatever region are staying home and not traveling to stores. And if this continues, we expect the revenue to further drop another 3%. That's better decision. But the real question everyone's faced with is knowing that revenue will go down 3%. What do you do about it? And this is really, really hard. I always think about how children pick what they're going to eat. Obviously, the apple is better for them long term. You know, that cupcake is pretty delicious right now. As we make decisions as business leaders, the right thing to do, if your revenue is dropping, might be to raise prices. But it might also be the very worst thing to do because it gives you that short-term sugar high, but causes you long-term customer loyalty and problems as people flip to alternate cheaper products. So you have to look at whether promotions, whether cross-selling, whether there's other ways for you to restore revenue or alternatively lower cost or prioritize your markets so you make a better decision to optimize against revenue and margin. That's what our customers are asking us to do, is to optimize across multiple objectives, revenue, margin, customer loyalty, risk, all these factors, and recommend at any given moment, what is the best thing to do? That best thing is not the same thing every time. It could change. It should change all the time. So we built prescriptive systems. This uses predictive models, as we talked about before, and then runs them through simulations, varying conditions, and identifying what is the best decision to make in a given moment, given your goals. In this case, if you're going to maximize profit or risk, you're going to make a different decision. So we've created an approach where people can pick, varying risk and profit, and then identify what some of the optimal conditions are, the optimal decisions to make in those conditions. This is a new way of thinking. This is modern decisioning. Knowing what happened, knowing why it happened, knowing what's going to happen next, and knowing how to make optimal decisions. And there are techniques and technologies available today that handle these problems. They're not easy, but they are all solvable. We actually built a model for COVID specifically that does this. We published it online so anyone can look at it, and it describes exactly what the predictive model is for every state and every country around the world, what's going to happen in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. At this moment, that's what the predictions tell us, what the confidence levels are, which factors have the highest causality, the why that's occurring, and then also what the best decision is between public safety and minimizing economic impact. It's completely doable, and it's new. And I think this is what people need to expect from modern decisioning. They need to know how to use all the data that matters. We need to ask our teams to help us understand causality. Causality is mathematical. It's not correlation. It tells you which factors have the highest causal impact on the business outcomes that you need. And knowing that helps you listen for the signals going on in the market. If social impact, for example, all those people baking sourdough bread, if that has high causality in the supply and demand of flour, then companies who are in that space should be listening for those signals. Now, that already happened. We don't know what the next signal is, but you need to be looking for things that do have high causality, and that causal relationship changes over time. You need to anticipate all the time what's coming next. So just because there was a straight line of revenue over the last 3 quarters doesn't mean fourth quarter is going to be higher. There's a lot of things that change that are causal, that are happening around you that you need to look for so you know what is likely going to occur. And then, of course, knowing how to make the best decisions is a new technique. There's a study that says human beings can at best optimize across maybe 3 goals, revenue, margin, customer sat. But AI-based systems, the systems we work with every day, can optimize across hundreds of goals. When people try to do that, it's like a coin flip. But machine systems can do this much better and at least help us inform us on what the risks are. We can still make our own choices. But I would love to know that when I make a big decision, that I've consulted analytics techniques like this, and I have a very good chance of making the best possible decision. So I just want to leave you with this thought. that as you look to your teams in data science and data engineering, and you look to your business leaders, make sure you have people who embrace these approaches and this mindset, who think in terms of the value of data, the importance of data, and the power that algorithmic approaches like causality, prediction, and prescription have, and how much change and impact they can have on your business.
Bret, this is fascinating. I think majority of your slides were question marks, and that's the right message. Unfortunately, even though we were going through cataclysmic changes last year, I saw too many companies go back to their tools they've used for a long time, right? CFOs rebudgeting almost on a daily basis, as if that would change anything, right? So like you say, there's a lot of new thinking, a lot of new techniques, a lot of new technologies. Mm-hmm. I'm just not sure 80 to 90% of the businesses are ready for it. So keep doing what you're doing. You're challenging people to not accept what they've done.
Yeah, I run a council of chief data officers across all industries, and everyone who comes always fears that they're somehow behind. In reality, everyone still has a long way to go to get to this modern approach. But the companies that I saw really thrive during the pandemic were companies that had really laid down that foundation of data, and their chief data officers had already elevated out of CIO functions into much more of a leadership role in business. And this is a journey. This is not something people just do overnight. But I put question marks on purpose because they're the questions our clients ask us every day. They're the questions they face for themselves. And I think there's a lot still to solve together. And so if there's a few companies that represent this in your industry, assume that 90% of them are not. And they're all working on this journey. And those who go faster and who make some really important decisions now will pull ahead.
One of my favorite case studies, I wrote it about 10 years ago, is the National Hurricane Center. And I wrote it, I go back to it every year, and there's several things that still stand out. You talked about external data. They keep looking for new sources all the time. Satellites, obviously, the hurricane hunters, ocean buoys, they keep looking for new ways to capture stuff because they can't buy it from anybody, right? They have to somehow manufacture the data. The other thing is the humility that they show. Every year they go back and audit their forecast tracks. How many companies do that, right? And then the third thing, you talk about humility, and I interviewed the executives there. I said, how many quantify the savings you've given the nation. He says, we do obviously because our forecasts have gotten better and better. We only evacuate 50 to 100 miles of coastline anymore, right? A few years ago, it used to be 300-400 miles. So that's cost savings right there. But he says, we don't think in those terms. We think in terms of how many lives we saved. But just the whole approach was so refreshing in terms of external data, validation, and so on. So it can be done, just needs people to challenge what they've been doing.
Yeah, and I see more and more people who really do understand it. And I'm so, inspired by the chief data officers that I think are speaking in business terms and are really pushing the envelope on these technologies and techniques.
Brad, this is fascinating. Thank you for, great questions, and keep doing what you're doing. We do need major refresh.
Thank you, Vinnie.